Fantastic. I've just heard that I am live. So hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me for making a Mammopede boss design on Sackboy, A Big Adventure. My name is Raymond Heiskomp. I'm a level designer at No Breaks Games in Tenerife, and I have my own indie studio called Roofcat. But neither of those are relevant for today's talk because I'm going to be talking about the time I worked at Sumo-Digital, where we made, big surprise, Sackboy, A Big Adventure. For those of you unfamiliar with the title, Sackboy, A Big Adventure is a 3D action platformer. It's made for both PlayStation 4 and 5, and it is playable with up to 4 players in both local and online co-op. And it features a number of expressive moves that you can use as a player, along with a number of tools and power-ups that you can pick up in levels to overcome dangerous hazards and find a number of enemies. Along with that, it features a number of bosses in the level, and this is a part of the game that I spend a lot of time on. I worked on designing a bunch of these bosses, prototyping them, and then making a number of iterations. Because it was a big project, though, I didn't work on all of these bosses. I worked on these bosses. To quickly go through some of the bosses I worked on the left, you see the 3 Vex Encounters. This is a recurring fight where you face off against the big bad guy Vex on a moving vehicle. Each of these encounters takes place in a different world, and they're all more dangerous than the last. And I put together a video showing off different iterations to kind of give you an idea of how this fight came to be. I have heard there might be some video display problems, so I hope this will not be too much of a slideshow, but let's just see.
Your worst nightmares are about to come true, and there's nothing you can do to stop me.
All right, hope that played all right. Then in the top right there is Naomi, which is a corrupted AI, which you turn off using a touchscreen while trying to dodge all the dangerous lasers and other attacks that it's throwing at you. I also have a video for this one. Again, let's hope the quality is good. I'm comparing with this one some prototype footage with how the final version turned out.
Better.
All right, and then on the bottom right, there is Mammopede. This is a giant centipede burrowing through the ground to who you can only deal damage when it exposes its vulnerable body parts whenever it tries and does one of its actions to squash you. So I've given you a bit of a taste of Vex and Naomi, which I spent quite a bit of time on, but most of the time I worked on bosses I really spend on Mammopede. You can see some of the different prototypes, some earlier versions on the left, but that's not really where this boss started, because these earlier prototypes were very heavily influenced by earlier boss fights, earlier prototypes that I had made. And those in turn were very much based on some of the very earliest prototypes that I created when I just started on bosses. So that is what I'm going to talk about during this talk. I'm going to talk about how I got started all the way to making the final Mammopede that made its way into the game. I'm going to talk about how that process went, some of the lessons that I learned along the way. But I do want to highlight that this is not a how to make bosses talk. I'm not going to give you 10 steps to make a boss in the end, but hopefully a number of the lessons that I learned and the iterations that I show will be able to help you with potentially making bosses or just avoiding bad decisions, making prototypes. I'm going to go through this in fairly chronological order. I'm going to, the first half of this talk is going to be pre-Mammopede. I'm going to talk about how I got started on bosses, some early prototypes, 2 big boss fights that were in prototype stage, the Amazon boss and the Undersea boss. And then finally, I'm going to talk about different iterations we made for Mammopede. But before we go all the way to the beginning, let me show you the final result, give you a bit of a taste of what it eventually turns into.
So I'll just leave you with another taste of the uproar and how it bends all creatures to my will.
All right, having seen the final result, let's go all the way back to the beginning when I just joined Sumo. So I joined Sumo-Digital as a level design intern, and quickly started picking up some tech design tasks as well, creating level objects, prototyping game modes, while still doing a number of level design tasks. And after working there for a number of months, I was asked to look into bosses. Now, there had been some previous boss prototypes made, but none of them had really stuck around. None of them were really solid enough to base the rest of the bosses on. So we needed someone dedicated to bosses to figure out what we were really aiming for, what kind of bosses we wanted to make. One of the reasons that they asked me to look into it because I hadn't tried it before, so they were curious if I had any new ideas to add to bosses. And secondly, I could do both the designing and implementation myself. So that allowed me to focus on making fun gameplay, but also make a lot of really quick iterations without needing to go back and forth communicating with the programmer. Some of the early goals that we had making these bosses really revolved around answering the question, how will bosses work in our game? And we did have some ideas of what we wanted. We wanted the bosses to have a big impact, and we wanted the bosses to really have a very dynamic camera to sell the 3D movement of our 3D platformer. We also wanted to try and make the first prototypes that I was going to attempt to make just based around Sackboy's moveset to see if Sackboy's expressive moves were enough to base something entirely around. So not using any of the tools or other mechanics in the different levels. So I got to work. I wrote out a number of briefs, and then I made my first attempt at a boss. This has a little visual representation of what that boss might have looked like. The basic fight went as follows. You have this static boss in the middle who has this line of sight attack whenever you get nearby, so you can't just walk up to it and deal damage. While the boss is in the middle, there's a number of these objects falling all throughout the arena from the ceiling, and once they hit the ground, they will start slowly drilling into the ground and disappearing. Obviously, you're trying to avoid these objects as they're falling down, but once they're on the ground, they can actually provide cover from that line of sight attack the boss has. So if they fall in the right position, you can use them to sneak up on the boss, avoid its line of sight attack, and deal some damage. So that was my first attempt at making a boss. I thought it was pretty cool, so I showed it to my leads. And to somewhat paraphrase, my boss said something like, "I don't think there's anything I like in this," which made a lot of sense because I had just made a boss all about stealth and finding cover in a 3D platformer that's all about jumping and fast action. So I had to go back to the drawing board. In our level design process for Sackboy: A Big Adventure, we worked very modularly. We would make small sections of a level, kind of work them out, see if the gameplay works really well, and then we would work that out into a big level. And I tried to do the same with the bosses after this. So I tried to work on these small boss interactions, and I tried to really focus on making these very dynamic feeling bosses. I had this one boss that would kind of stomp its way towards you, that you could topple over if you hit it at the right time. And I had this long-legged boss that would chase you. It would be a little bit faster than you, so it could catch up. And then once it's above you, it would try and squash its body down to deal damage to you. After making a number of these, I showed them to my leads, and they really liked this long-legged boss prototype. They thought it really had kind of a physical presence in the arena, felt very dynamic. So I flashed that out into a full boss fight. And the way that this one worked is it would chase you. It would do its squish attack once it's on top of you, once it's above you. And then once it has slammed its body down, it will stay on the floor with its weak spot exposed on its head. And it will fire a number of these projectiles, which may look somewhat similar to the projectiles I used in the previous prototype. You have to avoid getting hit by these projectiles, of course, but once they're on the ground, you can use them as a platform. And you can use them as a platform to get on the boss's head and beat up its weak spot. And that is how you progress in this boss fight. This was a lot more focused on the core gameplay of our game. It had a lot of platforming, had fast action. This dynamic camera that I had focused on the boss all the time, so it felt very 3D. But in spite of all of that, it was a pretty simple setup. The boss had some very clear actions that it would take, and the steps that the player had to take to progress the boss fight were pretty clear. So I turned this into a full boss fight with a number of different phases and the challenge increasing with each one of those, and it was pretty well received. So this was kind of our first taste of what we were going to do with bosses. I learned a lot from this early stage. To specifically call some things out, kill your darlings is a very often used phrase in the games industry. I had learned this before. I now very much learned this also applies to bosses. Don't get too attached because versions might not work even if you think they are awesome. Secondly, bosses can vary from normal gameplay. You can try something different, make something feel a little bit different than the normal levels, but they shouldn't rely on completely different gameplay. It's good to still build on your game's strengths. And finally, on the more production side of things, prototyping individual boss interactions was very useful for me because that allowed me to see what works and then build up from that rather than write out a whole boss fight, implement the entire boss fight, and then if it didn't work, I would not know what part of it wasn't working. So I had made this initial prototype for what we were going to be making as bosses. So now I was going to be working on bosses that would actually appear in the game. We were going to make these bosses called world monsters, and these were going to appear at the end of a world in a special type of level. They would utilize the tool and a number of the mechanics that appeared in this world. And we still had the same goals that we had previously of having a high impact and having a very dynamic camera. But we had some other things that we really started to consider at this point, which is that we wanted the fight to constantly be active. We wanted there to be a good flow to it, so no big safe spaces and no long pauses. Secondly, we were making a co-op game, so we had to really take that into account with everything we were making. And lastly, a lot of the early gameplay in Sackboy: A Big Adventure, a lot of the challenge is optional. So the bosses shouldn't be too hard, because if you can't beat the boss, you can't progress at all anymore. So it shouldn't be too crazy difficult, but it should still provide a good challenge because you want to use this boss to kind of prove your mastery of this world and the mechanics. So there was a balance to be found there. And the first world that I tried to make a world boss for was the Amazon. This was later renamed into the Colossal Canopy. And this introduced a tool called the World Tool, which is essentially a boomerang that collects power-ups. It can cut spiky vines, and it can damage enemies. And there were a lot of other mechanics in this world, such as in the top right, you can see Gloop, which allows you to walk on walls. There's darts that are firing around, and there's these spiky vines that are dangerous, but you can cut them up with the World Tool. So in my first attempt, I wanted to incorporate a lot of these mechanics. So I used the long-legged prototype as a base, but I also had a lot of other things. I had towers that would rise up from the arena firing darts. I would have Gloop that you could collect. I would have these vines sprouting. There would be water that you can swim in, but it will be removing the Gloop if you're having any of it. And of course, there was the World Tool. So just going to walk through the steps that you had to do in this fight to actually deal damage. So you had to obtain Gloop from somewhere in the level. The towers would rise up from somewhere in the arena. They would rise up from the ground and start shooting a bunch of darts. You had to avoid these. And then at the back of the tower, you can see a little slope. This is what you could use to climb onto the tower using the Gloop. So you had to get on there before the water would rise, because that would get rid of your Gloop. Wait for the water to get down again. Get off the tower. Avoid getting hit by the boss. And then once the boss slams down, you can see that the boss also has this kind of ramp on its side. So once it's on the ground, you can climb up on it using the Gloop and damage its weak spot. And I hope that sounds as awesome in your head as it did when I made it. But it was way too chaotic. There was way too much going on. There was no clear focus. And especially figuring out the next step for players was way too hard. I tried to make a number of variations on this, but it just didn't work. There was just too much stuff, too many different mechanics I was trying to use in this. So for my next iteration, I tried to focus on just one element. I also replaced the legs with wings, which made for a much more logical movement and allowed me to not obstruct the camera with these giant legs all the time, which is great. Here by my second attempt, I still had the boss chase you, slam down, and then it would spawn a number of these spiky vines around it. So you had to kind of run out of the way, and then you could turn around, cut the vines to get closer to the boss, jump up, and hit its weak spot with your whirl tool. So it was a lot more focused on this one particular mechanic, these spiky vines that you would interact with the whirl tool. After you had done that once, the boss would get a little bit harder, would go into a second phase. After it had slammed down, it would come back up a little bit, and it would carry this this weapon kind of that you can see at the bottom picture. So you couldn't reach it by just jumping up and throwing your whirl tool. You had to actually get on a platform. Luckily, when it would smash down, there would be some platforms with these spiky vines on top of them coming down. So you just had to cut the vines off of that, jump on it, use it as a platform to then jump and hit the boss. So that is how you would get through these first two phases. They worked quite well. They were much more focused also around the tool for this world. But I wanted quite a big, impactful change in the final phase. I wanted that to feel really epic. And after being stumped for ideas for a little bit, I decided to repurpose the idea from the very early stealth boss that I had made of a bunch of these objects falling down. So the way that worked is basically the entire arena would sink into the water, except for a small bit at the center. The boss would be flying around the edge of the arena, and there would be all of these platforms with these spiky vines that you encountered in the previous phase. They would be falling on the water and then slowly sinking down. So the way to actually get to the boss is you would be cutting the vines off of these platforms, jumping on the platforms, and then when the boss is close, throw your whirl tool at it, and that is how you would finally deal the last bit of damage and beat this boss. So I turned this into a full functional fight, and it was pretty well received as well. This basically was in the direction of being the boss for our, at that time, called Amazon World. Talked with a number of leads. There was concept art being made for it. And yeah, it just seemed like this was going to be the boss for Amazon. So I started to move on to new tasks. Main thing I learned from the very first phase was not to over-design things. There were a lot of really cool mechanic interactions in that particular part of the fight, but the full picture was a confusing mess. It also really made me reappreciate things like phases in a boss fight, because that allows you to introduce things piece by piece, building up on it in every phase rather than just kind of throwing everything at the player. I also figured out that combining puzzle and action gameplay is very hard to do in a boss fight. And it's kind of the reason that a lot of these bosses have giant glowing weak spots, because in the heat of battle, there's not that much time to think. So the steps to progress have to be quite clear. Otherwise, you risk getting your players stuck, and then they just avoid damage forever, and that does not feel very fun. I made quite a lot of quick iterations in this stage, and that was helped a lot by me not deleting functionality when we weren't using it. So if we had a cool action that the boss could take, but it didn't seem to work, I wouldn't actually delete the entire thing. I would just disable it. So later, if we wanted to try something that was somewhat similar, I could just repurpose it, and that just made things go a lot faster. And finally, I got some really good feedback for that final phase, which was that the boss moved really fast, so platforming to it and then hitting it felt really cool, but it also was very hard to pull off. And if you failed it, especially if you failed it twice, it felt very lame. It felt like maybe you couldn't pull this off at all. So the feedback was to really try and keep players of different skill levels in mind. It seems very obvious, but adding in more opportunities to deal damage to the boss and progress is very useful, and it will make your fight much more accessible. So in this particular fight, I made the boss slow down over time as it is doing its leaps around the arena in the final part of the battle, which means that if you fail it the first time, then the next time it's already going to be quite a bit slower, and it's a lot more possible for you to deal damage. All right, so I was done with the Amazon boss. Now I was going to look at another world. I was going to look at the Undersea boss, later renamed to the Kingdom of Crablantis. And this tool that it featured was the claw string. The claw string was essentially kind of a grappling hook. The tool was still very heavily in development while I was starting on this boss, but I started doing a bunch of experiments with it, focusing on swinging. I had maybe this idea of the boss being this giant floating fish that was above you, and you maybe bring it down as it passes by. The leads had some suggestions of maybe putting it in more of a closed arena than what I was trying out, and having the boss, rather than floating at the top, having it burrow its way underground. And they also had this idea that maybe it could be cool to use this kind of tug of war challenge where you could hook onto the boss and then pull it out somehow. So taking all of that into account, I made a boss fight, and the boss would do as follows. It would burrow through the ground, leaving a dangerous trail that would be hazardous to the player, and it would slowly start to limit the safe space that was left in the arena. It could leap towards Sackboy, it could rise up firing a giant shockwave, and there were these fishes around the arena that you could use your clustering on to kind of navigate the arena easily. But if you were hanging on there for too long, then to prevent you from abusing that mechanic, I had the boss go over there and eat up that fish. So you couldn't be safe for too long. In order to deal damage to this boss, when it would rise up to fire its shockwave, you could use a fish to quickly swing and land near it, tug it out with your grappling hook, and then basically its vulnerable body would be exposed, as you see in the lowest image, and you could beat that up and progress in the boss fight. So I made a full boss fight out of it. It was probably one of my favorite prototypes to make because it made just so much use of this clustering tool. It had a lot of really different ways that you were dealing with it and interacting with it, which was quite interesting. So I learned quite a lot from this as well, but most of it was kind of reinforcing the previous lessons. And one of the things I did pick up on was that I should avoid camera obstructions, because the reason that this boss, my initial version had the boss just floating around at the top, and my lead suggested putting it underground because the floating at the top boss would just obstruct your camera a lot, and that was not a good idea. Also made me realize that player-focused attacks feel very dynamic, and the reason that I only really kind of realized or stood still by that fact at this point was because I did the opposite here. I tried to have the boss attack just certain areas because I thought the player would have to be there to deal damage to the boss, but it just created too much safe space, and it just meant that you could kind of look at the boss doing its thing. It was not as engaging. So after that, I focused a lot more on just having fully player-focused attacks. So at this point, I had made an Amazon boss that flies and plants a bunch of spiky vines, and I had made this undersea boss that burrows through the ground and can be tugged out with a hook. Sadly, the clustering needed some iterations. It was a bit too hard to support all of the different boss behaviors, all of the different things that I was trying to do with it. So that one was a bit of shaky ground. We weren't sure if we were going to be able to make that boss fight work. Then the Amazon boss had another problem, which was that this 3D camera that was really dynamic, which we had been pushing for so hard, we couldn't polish it because we realized that with 4 players on the same screen in local or online multiplayer, all controlling the same camera and the camera also trying to look at the boss, it was too chaotic. We just couldn't make it work. So at this point, we also realized that we didn't have enough resources to make world monsters for every single world. So we started to think about these Vex Encounters, which I mentioned I also worked on. And one of those Vex Encounters was going to take place in the undersea world. So the undersea boss that I made was going to be scrapped, and we didn't necessarily have to think of a new boss as a new world monster because it was going to be replaced by this Vex Encounter. But we still needed something for the Amazon world. So either we would rework the Amazon boss to have a more 2D constrained camera, or we would start with something new. And one of the other designers had the idea of having this centipede, kind of related to a centipede enemy that we had in that world. And then maybe giving it giant spiky vines as segments, having it burrow through the ground, some ideas like that. And I was pretty eager to make the Amazon boss work. I had fully bought into the sunk cost fallacy, having worked a number of months on it. But I realized I should probably give the centipede idea a try and just kind of see how feasible it is. And I logically very quickly realized that a lot of the undersea boss could be repurposed to do a lot of the behavior that we had tried out here. And since the undersea boss was going to be cut anyway, I did that. I repurposed the undersea boss to work with the world tool. And instead of this kind of dangerous but abstract trail that the undersea boss had, I would have it spawn spiky vines behind it, which worked very well, also fitting it into the world. And I turned that into a full fight. And I actually have some footage from one of the earliest Mammopede prototypes, which I would like to show you now. So I'm going to quickly talk over this a little bit. What I find very fun is to see that a lot of the moves are already here. You can see, obviously, it doesn't have any art, and a lot of the execution is quite different. But you saw that it was just doing its chasing movement. Here it's coming up, firing a big shockwave, which also on this part of the fight is a very good way to deal damage. skip ahead in the fight a little bit. You can see that the ground has been split in two, and Mammopede is now doing its charge from wall to wall, which looks very different than how it looks in the final version, but it is still essentially the same move. And then finally, in the end, once you've dealt enough damage, Mammopede comes up in the middle. You can deal the final bit of damage, and you have beat her. So that makes this the final boss behavior slide because we made it all the way to Mammopede. In the first phase of the fight, Mammopede will burrow towards the player, leaving vines. She can leap towards the player. She can jump in the air, creating a big shockwave, and she can move along the edges of the arena in a circular motion. And anytime that she exposes her body as she takes one of these actions, that gives the player an opportunity to deal damage by hitting one of her segments with the whirl tool. Now, most of these moves stay the same in the second and third phase, but each time that the phase changes, the arena splits, and Mammopede goes into a rage, firing a number of different shockwaves. One change that does change is Mammopede will no longer do her circular attack. Instead, she will charge from left to right or right to left, from one wall to the other, trying to catch Sackboy on the way to the other wall. Now, even though a lot of these moves have stayed the same, there were a lot of different iterations, a lot of work on the behavior, on the art. So I'm going to go through the fight and basically talk about a lot of iterations, design decisions, and a number of tricks that we did to try and make things better. And I'm going to start with that before the fight actually happens. So when we were working on the very earliest iterations of this fight, you would just start right in the arena, get the whirl tool, and start battling. But we needed really a place to give you the whirl tool, and so we also used this to reintroduce using the whirl tool, cutting vines with it, and also worked very well to add some tension as it leads up to this big door that slowly opens towards the boss fight. We had quite some iterations on the arena as well. We were afraid that it looked a bit like a boss in one of the early versions, so one of the fellow designers mocked up a version that looked like it was in a lake. But we kind of went back to the more room structure idea, and we made it make more sense by having a little bit less organic objects make 90-degree turns, but having that be made out of structure. Then Mammopede itself had a lot of iterations. The visuals on the left, you can see, are much more motherly, the mama part of Mammopede. On the right, it's a lot more dangerous, which I think is the right way to go. Also because the part of the head that was sticking out for the motherly version were these antennae, which didn't very clearly read as dangerous or show what direction she was facing at any time. And the V that we have in the final version is much easier to read. So going on to some actual gameplay, just a design kind of note, the vines worked extremely well to keep this fight active. Even when Mammopede is not currently doing something, you still have something to do. The players, it's very noticeable when players are left alone with the vines. They'll just cut them all down to make sure that the arena is clean and they can dodge anywhere, preparing for any future attacks from Mammopede. Then at first I had the chase behavior be a lot more dynamic. It would slow down and then it would rush towards the player, and I thought that would be very interesting, but it was actually just very hard to read. So we made that, I made Mammopede just move towards you at a consistent speed while she is underground, and that made the entire thing much clearer. We shortened vines. I was afraid this was going to be too easy at some point, but it actually gave players just more ways to interact with it. You can jump over it or cut through them or avoid them. And what also really helped with this was that it didn't obscure certain areas. It didn't obscure any Sackboys or health pickups or something like that. Then we also weren't sure how to do spawning in the boss fight for quite a long time, because usually we just have the static checkpoints in the level. But if we were going to do that here and we would place it on the ground, that wouldn't work very well because Mammopede can burrow everywhere and everything is supposed to be dangerous. On the wall, it would be possible, but if Sackboy spawns just at the time the boss is below him, then they will hit Mammopede. That would not be perfect either. So I set up this system where the checkpoint comes down on a string, and it will choose whether to spawn you on the left or the right side based on where Mammopede is. So it will try and basically dynamically avoid where the boss is at. One thing we couldn't dynamically avoid was the spiky vines, because theoretically there could be spiky vines on either side of the arena. Theoretically, they could be everywhere in the arena. So a simple trick, I just cut the vines. Whenever the checkpoint comes down, it has a giant collider around it, and all of the vines will be gone, and players won't land on it, and it will be fine. Then one interesting experiment that we did but didn't actually end up doing anything with goes back to the burrowing. So whenever Mammopede burrows through the ground, she has this kind of ground deformation effect around it, making it seem like the ground is raised up. But that's just visual. There's no actual collision there. So if you walk over that, Sackboy's feet are going to kind of clip into the ground. One of my seniors thought that it would add a lot to make sure that the collision kind of matches that visual over there. We weren't sure if it was going to be necessary, but I worked about 2 weeks on it, found an awesome solution. We tested it, and he was like, yeah, I don't notice the difference at all. So we decided not to do that. But that was an interesting experiment we did as well. Something that we experimented and made a lot of iterations on as well was with the VFX. One of the things I gave artists a headache with a lot was the Shockwave, because most of our game is very physically grounded, crafted from real world materials. So we were trying to avoid this kind of ethereal wave that you see in a lot of games. And one of the things we tried to have these vines that would grow, then shrink down, and then grow a little further away, kind of making this wave slowly, which looked super interesting and extremely confusing, especially if there were more waves going on at the same time. Luckily, our antagonist turned out to be Vex, who is a magician, and he's controlling all of these bosses. So it became a lot more acceptable to have these kind of magic shockwaves. And I think the final result looks very, very good. It's very readable, so I'm very happy with it. Then one of the final moves that Mammopede has in the first wave is this circular pattern. And this isn't as much of an attack. It's pretty easy to avoid. But this is actually just to make sure that players see all of the different segments, and they kind of have an easy way to deal damage in this first part of the fight. So they know how to progress. They know how to get on with the fight, hit these segments, and that is how you get further. And that's honestly, that's what this part of the fight is for, just to make sure that the player knows what they're supposed to be doing. Now, once you've hit all of these different segments, you're not going into the next phase right away, but there's going to be the phase transitions. And these were one of the hardest things to make really clear. We needed to make it obvious that the fight was progressing, and we also needed to make it obvious that the segments would be reinflated. So at first, we just had the crack in the floor appear after Mammopede landed. But later we had, and you'll see that in the next part of the clip, Mammopede would actually go into that crevice and then push it open by inflating her different segments. We really wanted to sell, hey, the segments are reinflated. This is a new part, a new stage, a new phase of the boss fight. You can see that the final version of the fight shows this. The segments getting inflated, air being sucked in. And with all of this action, all of the focus on Mammopede, I think it's pretty clear that the fight progresses, and it makes enough sense that all of the segments have been reinflated. One trick that probably not a lot of players notice consciously is that during Rage, the health disappears. So once you deal the final bit of damage, you can see on the left the health bar sneaks off out of view. And I like to think that players subconsciously notice this and are aware that they can damage Mammopede during this time and just avoid damage until the Rage phase is over and the health reappears again. Initially, we also had some smaller enemies, which is very often the case in boss fights, just as a change of pace. But we didn't want to take away the focus from Mammopede. So instead, we had Mammopede do the shockwaves, which still made the gameplay quite a bit different from the rest of the boss fight, but it was just still focused on her. There weren't suddenly these other enemies that you had to deal with. The arena also gets worn down more and more throughout the fight, and this happens at each transition as well. And the reason we did this was to make progression feel more tangible, so you can see the area getting more and more destroyed. And then one of the other things that happens during the phase transition is that her segments change. Since we're making a co-op game, up to 4 players can be standing there throwing whirl tools and just destroying the boss whenever she comes out. So I made the boss have more segments to account for the amount of players, but I don't want to change this the moment that a player hops in and out, because that can happen at any point during the fight. And if you're keeping track and you realize there's only 1 segment left, suddenly a friend joins and there's 3 segments left, that's just going to be very confusing. So I made sure that this change only happened in the phase transition whenever she would reinflate all of her different segments. Then it would also take into account how many players there are. So a little bit about gameplay again. So this fight uses the whirl tool, and you use the whirl tool a lot, but of course it's also used in the levels. And there's something really useful is targeting. It can keep going, it can hit multiple targets, which is very cool in levels, but it can make the boss way too easy. Here you can see If the whirl tool would just go around and hit all of these individual segments, which all only need to be hit once, the boss fight would be over in a second. So we had to make some custom interactions between the whirl tool and the segments to make sure that the whirl tool would just return to Sackboy immediately. We didn't have that in this particular iteration, which is why the whirl tool just gets destroyed. But in the final version of the fight, we have some correct behavior for that, allowing you to only hit one of those segments at a time. And then, so the one change in actions that Mammopede has when going from phase 1 to the other phases is that the circular attack is replaced by the charge. And this is because we don't want to give you such easy shots later in the boss fight. But this charge still gives you a good chance to hit every one of these segments, since all of them come by at a consistent speed. So there's not one of them that will always be very difficult to hit. And then, final bit of the fight, the final hit. We used to separate this out in the very first prototype. Once nearly all the health was gone, Mammopede would just kind of come up in the middle and let you deal the final bit of damage. I thought this was going to feel very empowering and cool, but it actually felt quite fidgety. It felt weird that she would just wait for you there. And it also wouldn't make sense once we added those segments. So in the end, we just made it that the final segment that you hit triggers in slow motion to make it feel cool. And then immediately it goes to the victory screen. Now, immediately getting you to the victory screen was actually really important because we wanted to make sure that there was no chance of you getting killed after you had actually defeated the boss fight. If you had just defeated it on your last life and then you hit some random spiky vine that was still there and you died and you had to replay it, that would be very frustrating. So we avoided that by just having you get to the end screen right away. And with that, we did it. We defeated Mammopede. So we made it through all of these prototypes, all of these different iterations. So some final lessons to add. The first one is that proving and disproving ideas in our situation was often much easier by implementation than by discussing it, because it was very hard to predict changes to such a dynamic situation, such as the changes that it would have to add collision underneath ground deformation. We weren't sure, and we had to test it out. Then, because I was working on the same boss for so long, I knew exactly how to play it. I knew exactly how I wanted it to be played, and it was very hard to be bad at it. So playtesting was invaluable. Having other designers playtest my game, but also some artists and mostly just people that hadn't actually played it before, that was super helpful to let me see very obvious errors and readability issues and difficulty spikes that I just couldn't see for myself anymore. What also helped was taking breaks. So working on another boss fight or working on some systems, when I would get back to the Mammopede, I could kind of have a better overview. I wouldn't be deep down in the trenches on one particular feature, but it helped me to kind of see things a bit clearer. Then what I didn't cover is that my final task was helping code to convert this blueprint that I made for Mammopede into C++. I had made the entire Mammopede in blueprints, and this was super useful because we could iterate on it at any point, and I always had access to all the functionality. So I'm very grateful that this conversion happened only after the gameplay was really solidified, so that up until that point we could iterate very easily. The process of converting also went very well, but yeah, I didn't have to still iterate a lot when it was all in C++. And finally, I learned a little bit to embrace cliches. As a game designer, I often try and make things as unique as possible, and a lot of the time, especially with these kind of like very mainstream appeal games, that's not very helpful because cliches are there for a reason. Phases work very well to introduce different elements. Obvious weak spots let players know what to focus on. And shockwaves are super useful because they're easy to read and they can cover a pretty wide area, so players will probably have to interact with them. All of the features that you see on screen here are just features that I've seen in numerous different boss fights across numerous different games. And the ones that aren't crossed out here are used basically directly in Mammopede. I just want to say cliches can be a very powerful tool to use. Don't obviously copy an entire other boss, but adopt and adapt these cliches to make a really cool boss out of it. So with that, I want to say a big thank you to everybody at Sumo-Digital, everybody at XDev PlayStation Studios, as well as all of the other various studios that worked on creating this title. It was my first big title that I worked on. Super excited to have been part of it. Really glad, really proud of the game that ended up coming out of this. And I want to say a big thank you to Devcom for having me and the volunteers for making sure all of this runs well. Staff as well, of course. You guys have been amazing. And with that, that was my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this was interesting, perhaps useful for your own boss fights. Feel free to reach out at Roofcat Games on Twitter, and there will also still be some questions. So feel free to ask.
Thank you so much, Raymond. Devcom team, I want to thank you. And I see really nice questions in the tab, so we can move to the wrap-up room and start answering those questions.
Awesome.